Welcome to Unveiling Death. I am Rabbi Jeffrey Weil. Cremation or burial, a Jewish view with Doron Kornbluth. Burial of the deceased is a mitzvah in Judaism, a religious commandment. But increasing numbers of Jews are opting for cremation. Besides its religious implications, cremation presents environmental implications that surprise many. I will discuss this cremation trend, its reasons and ramifications with author Doron Kornbluth. Doron Kornbluth's books include Why Be Jewish?, The Jewish Holiday Handbook, and Cremation or Burial, A Jewish View. They've sold more than 100,000 copies. He is a sought-after speaker and frequent contributor to the Jerusalem Post and Chabad.org. He's a licensed tour guide in Israel, Poland, and Eastern Europe, and co-publisher of Mosaica Press. Doron lives in Jerusalem. Please follow Unveiling Death and like it and share it. Now here's my conversation with Doron Kornbluth. Hello, Doron Kornbluth. Welcome to the Unveiling Death podcast.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I am really interested in the book Cremation or Burial, and I've read it a couple of times. It's very crisply written and very informative and very conversational in tone. So I recommend it to everyone. You've written books on various topics, and I'm wondering what led you to take this issue on, cremation or burial from the Jewish perspective.
So it's an interesting story that I think about. I was actually never into the subject of death and burial and cremation. Avoided it like the plague, actually. My background is just positive community identity. I focused mostly on the Jewish community. So it was, I wrote something on why be Jewish and raising kids to love being Jewish, a lot of talks for teens and 20s. And then I guess it's about 15 years ago, I was in Florida on a speaking tour, and I opened up a Jewish newspaper, I forget which one, and there was an ad from a Jewish funeral home in a Jewish newspaper offering Jewish cremations. And I am a traditional Jewish boy from Montreal, Canada. I didn't know there was anything like a Jewish cremation. I didn't know that existed. Growing up, I was born in the 60s, but I'm really a child of the 70s and the 80s. Like there were certain things that like all types of Jewish people in the community, whether you were more observant, less observant, very religious, less religious, certain things everybody did. My day growing up, everybody went to shul on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement. No matter what they did during the year, everybody was there. Everybody but kosher meat, interestingly. More religious, less not religious, but kosher meat was just standard. Jews didn't buy retail. That was just a rule that we just knew this kind of stuff. And one of the things was like Jews didn't cremate. It was a generation after the Holocaust. It was just unthinkable. And suddenly in Florida, I'm like faced with the fact that, oh my gosh, this is like a major thing. And I started to research it and get into it. And the eventual result was my book, Cremation or Burial, A Jewish View. And that's been out for about 12, 13 years now. And it's, I guess, sort of a niche book and a niche subject has kind of hit a vein. And people have seen that this is not like a morbid subject. This actually is a lot more about how we live than about how we die.
Why do you think it is people who are moderately observant and people who are completely not observant? And when it comes to this stage, and suddenly they're like very meticulous about it, or at least want to know the information, whereas so much in their lives Jewishly, their diet, kashrut and Shabbat and so much else, they have a certain insouciance about. But here suddenly they're, we call them machmir, like they want to be very strict about it. Do you have any insight as to why that might be?
It is fascinating. I don't have a full answer. I had a rabbi friend who said that his job in life was to be with people when they match, hatch, and dispatch, meaning people are connecting to Judaism. I suppose it's true for other religions as well. I don't know. But when they're going through big life cycle events, getting married, having a child, and dispatch at the end of life. So I think it's just part of human nature that these big life changes, we want to connect in some way to who we are. I will say that sensitivity that you're referring to, that even people who are not so connected to other parts of Judaism or Jewish tradition or Jewish life are very sensitive to this issue. That is less and less true. My generation, it was true. Today, following American norms, roughly 40% of the American Jewish dead are being cremated. It's roughly 40%. We don't know for sure, but it's roughly 40%. American norms for the 340 million Americans of all ethnic and religious persuasions, it's over 50% today. That changed in 2017. Cremation went from being a minority to a majority choice. So that sensitivity is largely leaving, but it's still a remnant of, this is an important permanent choice. People used to visit cemeteries and visit their loved ones. And, so I think it's still in the psyche a little bit, but I'll give you another example. Why is it that the Passover Seder people keep, but 7 weeks later, the holiday of Shavuot, people don't in general, unless they're Orthodox or very religious or whatever. But certain things just last and tap into a consciousness, and certain things less so. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I don't know either. I wonder if there's something, the idea, even the word of evolution when it comes to religious practice could be fraught. But, there's a natural evolution to people's practice, communities' practice of their religious rights. And that might, it's happened within the Jewish world too, for sure. And maybe the reason that the Passover Seder is so, widely observed and Shavuos is not, has something to do, maybe it's part of a natural process, but that would be obviously a liberal understanding of that.
I would say like this, if the Holocaust had not happened, I don't know if my generation, and I don't know if there would have been such a sensitivity to cremation. There was already a fad of cremation in the 1890s in England. It was already growing. And in the Jewish community, at least, the Holocaust pushed it away for a couple of generations because the Nazis killed us twice, so to speak. It was the murder, and then it was just the burning of bodies, not allowing for Jewish burial. So that kind of gave us a protective edge on this subject for, 30, 40 years. That's gone largely. I've met Holocaust survivors that are choosing cremation. It's not the norm, but it exists.
There's this notion, and it's a traditional notion, that some people, for whatever reason, respond particularly strongly to certain mitzvot. Like, there's a story in Talmud about this student who is very into the tzitzit, and it turns his life in a positive way. There's another sage who's very into honoring father and mother, Tarfon. And I'm wondering if this, either what brought you to the book or while writing Cremation or Burial, if somehow this brought you closer or demonstrates that you are particularly close to the mitzvah of burial. But in a way, the question is a strange one for you because you're an observant Jew. And that kind of creates a hierarchy of mitzvot, of keeping commandments.
So it's a very interesting question because on the one hand, the Talmud does say very clearly that all of Judaism applies to all Jews, and we each need all those connections. And don't look at them as 613 commandments, look at them as 613 gates, that they're all paths into our spirituality and our self-development. So, Yom Kippur is for everybody, and Shofar and Rosh Hashanah is for everybody, and the Pesach Seder is for everybody. But the Talmud does say that, as you're referring to, that there are certain personal connections that seem deeper than others. We don't know exactly if that's because, that this person's soul has a particular tikkun, as we call it. Tikkun is a fixing, a tweaking, that has to be done, or maybe they were in a previous incarnation. We believe in that stuff. There was something to fix or something to share, or we don't know exactly why, but there's no question that we relate certainly to certain mitzvahs more than others. And that's a beautiful thing. That's a good thing. Again, there's something that all of Torah sort of connects us all to each other, where we all have a baseline. But on the other hand, there's certain parts that appeal to us individually, and that's beautiful, and that's personal, and that's holy. That's great. I don't know exactly why I fell into this. I'm not sure. I will say that even before I was, had this speaking tour story that I mentioned in Florida, where I came across the newspaper article. Even before that, I was always very touched when I would go to ancient Jewish cemeteries. I remember in 1989, dating myself, in the fall of 89, I spent a year, I was in the middle of university. I went to L'Université de Montréal, a French-speaking, largely Roman Catholic university in Montreal, kind of like the French McGill. And I was in my second to last year, and I did an exchange program. I was in France for the year. And a couple months in, there was a news report of this cemetery, this Jewish cemetery in the Ukraine that had been desecrated, and really badly desecrated. They dug up a body and they mutilated it, and then the gravestones and whatever it was. And I remember that I was really affected by it. And then I was really affected by the fact that I was affected by it, because I remember thinking, I've never been to the Ukraine. I have been now, but at the time, I've never been to the Ukraine. My ancestors don't even come from the Ukraine, largely from Russia and Germany, and a little bit of Poland, and don't speak Ukrainian. Don't have, so why was it bothering me? And I realized, well, it's bothering me because this is my people, and it really got me. So that I think already the fact that it was a cemetery and it really got to me. I think there was some kind of sensitivity to this subject, which I just try and do my part and stay connected to it and help others along the way.
Right, right. You mentioned earlier, sort of preface things by saying you get into this work, your work of writing, largely for, I don't know, sort of communal reasons, trying to keep the integrity of the Jewish community, keep us yoked to, I guess, mitzvot or traditional observance or whatever it is. But that story that you just told about how the Jewish cemetery in Ukraine was desecrated and so forth, part of it seemed to be a broadly on the Israel communal component to it for you. It resonated for you in that way, even though your people, your direct line, you're not from that area, but it just struck you as a Jew. And yet there might be also something about the fact that it was this particular kind of desecration, that it was a cemetery, that struck you also.
Yeah, both elements I think are there. I will say that on the cremation issue, I don't know how much of it was like communal integrity and tradition and things like that. Those who have read my book or heard me speak on the subject, that's sort of not the beginning point. The beginning point is when I looked into this, I was starting in this story in Florida around, this 2009, 2010 is when I saw the article, I think, the ad. But I was amazed at how much misinformation is out there and how much misinformation I had myself, because I didn't know much about, after I saw this, I spent about 3 years researching the subject, and I really went deep dive. I mean, I read everything on the subject that, as far as I know, that exists, existed at the time. I did all the environmental research. I got the blueprints of the crematory oven from several companies to actually figure out their energy use. I really did a very deep. I went into funeral homes. I talked to funeral directors. I went to I did a lot. What surprised me along the way is I don't know, this is like a new phrase. I don't want to, but the fake news, the misinformation on the subject.
Hmm.
And listen, everybody makes their own choices in life. And I'm a big believer in free choice. God's a big believer in free choice. We have it. That's, some say that the very phrase that when we're created in the image of God, that we have human choice, that we're able to create, we're able to make decisions. So, and I was amazed because I had always assumed, as the cremation companies, they call themselves societies, and society implies that it's a nonprofit. The cremation racket, and I call it that carefully, cremation racket is a multi-billion-dollar industry controlled by a few conglomerates. And the image that they're selling, we are more natural. It's better for the environment. Like the images you have, like a woman with her elderly mother walking on the beach and dolphins. This is the actual stuff that I've seen. And environmentalists are not in favor of cremation. It's simply not true. They're not. Cremation uses a tremendous amount of fossil fuels. We're all trying to get hybrid cars and electric cars. You're suddenly spending a huge amount of electricity. It spews tremendous chemicals into the air. Many towns, cities have rules about crematorium not being beside schools. It's a municipal rule in many areas. Ask yourself why. I remember when COVID hit in 2020, there was an article in the Los Angeles Times that the LA City Council was temporarily relaxing its rules on the number of cremations that a crematorium could do in a day. Because unfortunately, there were so many people dying, they had to relax the rules. But just think about what that means. LA, like every city, has a rule of how many cremations they can do in a day because it spews. Environmentalists are in favor of what's called green burial. Green burial is famous for two things: no metal caskets, terrible for the environment; no embalming, disgusting and really bad. 8 to 10 gallons of toxic liquids going into the ground every time, right? So notice anything about those two elements, metal caskets and embalming? We don't do them. Jewish burial is a paradigm of environmentally sound practices. You can always improve cemetery, the way they're designed. And I thank God, actually, there's been a lot of improvement recently. But the green burial is very much in line with traditional Jewish burial. So this whole line of thought that cremation is better for the environment is simply not true. In most cases, in some cases, it's neutral and they both have pluses and minuses. In most cases, actually, burial is much better. And I'm not talking embalming and metal caskets, but Jewish burial. So once I came across that, there's a lot of other pieces of misinformation that people have. Once I came across it, I was like, listen, people will do what they want, and I respect that. But at least let's share some basic info so people can make their own, their own decisions. I'll give you another example if I can. There's that, listen, no one's going to visit my grave, so why bother having one? This may explain why cremation rates in Florida are actually higher than most states. You have a lot of retirees in Florida. And so the person will say, well, listen, where am I going to be buried? Down here in Florida, everybody I know here is in a retirement home. They're going to die soon if they haven't already. And my kids aren't here. I moved down here 10 years ago. My kids are up in New York or they're in California. Like my kids aren't that religious, aren't that traditional. Nobody's going to visit the grave. So why bother having one? So let me test your Jewish knowledge, Jeff. It's okay. So say it like this. True or false? The most famous site, I'm speaking to you here from Israel, the most famous tourist site in Israel is the grave of Moses, the Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu. True or false?
False.
False. How do you know it's false?
Because we don't know where Moses was buried.
Good. Two main reasons. Well, three reasons. One is that if it was a tourist site, we'd all have been there already. Okay, but aside from that,
it's also not in Israel. Yeah.
Correct. Excellent. Those are the two reasons. The Torah says, the end of the Bible, the Torah says very clearly that Moses died before he entered the promised land. He did not enter the promised land, right? So he's buried in what's today the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, on the other side of the Jordan River, east of here. And second of all, as you said clearly, the verse makes it clear we don't know where he's buried, right? The commentators explain that he was such a great person and such a great prophet that it might have come to some kind of like idol worship, that people would have like worshipped him. So God hid it away. So let me ask a question. Has anyone ever consciously visited the grave of Moses? And the answer is no, never in history. No one has consciously, maybe somebody walked by it and didn't know, right? But no one has consciously visited the grave. And yet, 3,000 years ago, God made it clear. By the way, we know archaeologically at that time, there was plenty of cremation. It existed. It was the norm, right? Tibetan sky burial. You put the body up on a tower, and the vultures
get it. Yeah.
The Vikings, of doing different versions of that throughout history, putting the body on a boat and letting it go down River of Flame. There were many methods of dealing with dead bodies, and yet God chose to bury Moses because in our minds we think, understandably, that the two things are connected. That having a grave is because people should visit the grave. If nobody's going to visit the grave, then why bother having a grave? This story of Moses, the most famous burial in the Torah, teaches us those two things are disconnected. It's beautiful if you like visiting graves. I actually get a lot out of it. Don't worry, I don't go every day. I'm not a weirdo. But I actually connect to it. There's no obligation in Judaism to visit graves. If you don't connect to it, you don't have to. It's a beautiful thing for a family, whatever, but you don't have to. But it has nothing to do with whether or not this body and this soul deserves a grave and needs a grave. And the story of Moses actually teaches us that even if nobody theoretically is ever going to visit the grave, it's important to have one. By the way, I'll give you a little postscript. In my experience, it's amazing how often there is a grandkid or a nephew or a cousin 10 years later or 20 years later or 2 years later gets into Jewish genealogy, that gets a little more traditional, and having that grave is important for them. But even if not, it's still an important thing in and of itself. So that's some of the ideas. There's a lot more in my book. There's talks online that people can see of just sharing information. So listen, people make their own decisions. I respect that. But at least let's get the main ideas out there so people can make an informed decision and understand why Jews, not just Judaism, why Jews have focused on burial so much. We even see it right now where the negotiations through the US with Hamas, Israel, everybody knows that throughout the last decades, state of Israel has given up thousands of terrorists in order to get back hostages and POWs and things like that. What is less known is that we've given up hundreds of living terrorists to get back dead bodies and give them people we knew were dead and to give them proper burial. By the way, you can agree or disagree that that's a good strategic thing. I'm not getting into the right or wrong. I'm just saying, but the fact that we do it shows how important this is to the Jewish people.
In your book, mentioned something really fascinating theologically, that there's a nexus between burial and monotheism.
The way that I explain it to myself and to audiences when I give talks on the subject is the following. Imagine you were to make two maps of the world. A map of monotheism, meaning outline geographically around the world where people believe in one God versus where people believe in no gods or many gods, right? So it's monotheism versus, call it atheism, polytheism. So it's a monotheism map. And then make another map of what I call the burial map, where people tend to bury versus where people tend to cremate. And you were to take those two maps, monotheism map, burial map. Take the two maps, let's say that's my two ends. They are almost identical. They're not exact, there's exceptions to every rule, but just think about it, okay? In where I am in the Middle East, right? Islamic countries. There's no cremation in Islamic countries at all. They don't allow it. It doesn't exist. Islam is perfectly monotheistic. There's only one crematorium in all of Israel. 10 million people, one crematorium, mostly services the non-Jewish population of Israel. Right?
Where is that, by the way?
Haifa.
In Haifa.
Go to Europe, by the way. Pre-World War II, there had been essentially a ban since Charlemagne, 1,000 years, in the Catholic Church, no cremations at all, which is why you find there's ancient graveyards all over. Since World War II, roughly, post-Christian Europe, cremation is now the norm. There's almost no new graveyards going up. Cremation is like over 70%, right? Go to India, polytheistic, I believe in many gods, cremation is the norm, right? Even in the States, in the Bible Belt, burial rates are far higher, not 100%, but burial rates are far higher than the quote unquote secular coasts, right? It's just an interesting dynamic that where you find higher belief in one God, you find higher burial rates.
That's a correlation. What's the cause, do you think?
Great question. There's a lot of literature, there's a lot of thought on the subject. I'll share with you the explanation that makes the most sense to me. Again, we're looking at the people's psyches and why the connection happens, so it's a bit speculative, but I'll tell you what makes the most sense to me. At the beginning of the Bible, in the Torah, it says that the human being is created in the image of God, B'Tselem Elokim. The Torah, our Torah, the Bible, is the proof text of monotheism, right? Christianity takes off from there and Islam takes off from there. It's the original, right? So that image of God is not a physical thing. God doesn't have an image, but there's something about our image that is divine. And you don't mess with that image. I think there's a sensitivity to it. The phrase that I heard, I think the source for this is Thomas Lynch, who was an interesting fellow who was a poet and an undertaker. So he said like this: we bury treasure, we burn the garbage. Just an interesting thing, Things that you love, you bury. Treasure is buried. So the soul, the human being, the body, I think that monotheists, people who believe in God, are just a little more sensitive to the holiness of it. And so they lay it down to rest. The word cemetery, interestingly, comes from the ancient Greek kometra, means sleeping place. That's why graves usually have a resemblance to a bed. In most cultures, in most things, like actually in Israel, they build it up and actually looks like a bed. But even when it's just the grass, it's like a headstone. Like, it's an interesting thing because there's rest in peace. What's that phrase used? And it's the English version. There's all different versions. Rest in peace. The implication being that it's a rest and the person will come back. The person is asleep. The person still lives in a certain sense. And you don't mess with that. You let it be. Just if I have another second, there's a beautiful idea that I heard. This is the Zaravka Rabbi Tukachinsky. Years ago, he wrote a set of books in Hebrew called The Gate of Life, the Gesher Chaim, the Bridge of Life, I think. And he said the following. He said, when you take a seed and you plant it in the ground, what happens? So a plant grows. Beautiful. If you take a seed and you burn it and you put it in the ground, what happens? Nothing. Because the idea is that we don't understand how this works, but we sense that we're not just physical. There's something deep and beautiful and spiritual, and you don't burn that. You just put it in the ground gently, and you let nature take its course. Plant, grows, goes back to Mother Nature. An animal is born, grows, runs around the forest, goes back to Mother Nature. We let nature take its course, and we let the soul come back in whatever form it's going to be coming back in. So that's a little bit of the things that I try to share with people, just to get them thinking beyond the cremation society, business ads.
Beautifully expressed. It deserves an amen. And I thank you for that. And I thank you so much for talking to me, Doron Kornbluth, about
it's been a pleasure.
Your thoughts in the book and everything else. So very grateful for your being on Unveiling Death.
I hope there's been some ideas that will help your listeners, and keep doing the good things you're doing.
Thank you so much, and you as well. I hope you're enjoying this music by Brian Jablow. Thank you so much to podcast editor Bethany Subban Milano. Follow Unveiling Death and share this and other episodes with your friends and your foes alike. Thanks for listening to Unveiling Death, Eternity in about 24 minutes.